Okay, welcome back. We finished up the Abraham cycle, and now we're going to go talk about the Jacob cycle for a while. As we said in our discussion of the Abraham cycle, kind of the primary driver of the action of the plot in the book of Genesis is going to be that threefold promise that God gives to Abraham beginning in chapter 12, where he promises Abraham land, descendants, and blessing. We also said that the rest of the book is kind of devoted to trying to see whether and how that promise can come true, especially in spite of the many barriers to that promise which appear through the story, barriers that are out of Abraham's control, but also some barriers of his own making. Dr. Arnold, in his Genesis commentary, suggests that there are a few differences in emphases between the two cycles. In the Abraham cycle, we're concerned mostly with the promise being passed from the father to the son. The new element that is going to be introduced in the Jacob cycle is going to be the issue of relationships within the same generation in a story. In addition, the Abraham cycle concerned the promise. The Jacob cycle is going to add in the element of blessing and focus more on that as well. We saw that the Abraham cycle is going to end in chapter 25 with Abraham's death, and then we're going to move on to the Jacob cycle. So I would like briefly to show you the outline of that, and then we will go through some of these stories and try to see what they contribute to what the author is trying to accomplish. The outline of the Jacob cycle, or the structure, can essentially be described as a chiasm, or what is sometimes referred to as a concentric ring structure, where we have the first and the last parts of the story correspond to one another. So we have a genealogy up here at the beginning and another genealogy at the end. Then the second element of the story will correspond to the second to last element of the story. So Isaac and a foreigner in chapter 26, and then Jacob's sons and a foreigner in chapter 34. And on we continue. In a structure like this, usually the authors are trying to indicate that the central part of the story, the central part of this structural outline is really kind of the most important part of the story, and is kind of what the story is all about. That's where the meat of the story is. That's where the central themes come from, and we will see how that works. Let's go back again then and begin from the beginning and talk a little bit about some of these points here on the outline. We're going to have the genealogy of Ishmael in chapter 25, verses 12 to 18, and that's going to kind of frame the story. And then from there, we're going to go on and talk about Isaac's interaction with a foreigner, in this case, King Abimelech. This story is going to begin with the repetition of the promise to Isaac of land, descendants, and blessing. In verses 3 through 5, God appears to Isaac and says to him, "Reside in this land as an alien, and I will be with you and will bless you. For to you and all your descendants I will give all these lands, and I will fulfill the oath I swore to your father Abraham." So what's happening here now is that Isaac is becoming a patriarch in his own right. His father Abraham has died, and so now that promise of land, descendants, blessing, that covenant with Abraham is being passed down to his son. Also, let's take a look briefly at chapter 26, verse 24, where again the promise is being described. God will appear again to Isaac, and he will say, "I am the God of your father Abraham. Do not be afraid, for I am with you and will bless you and make your offspring numerous for my servant Abraham's sake." So the promise is still valid, since it was given to Isaac's father Abraham. But also Dr. Arnold points out that it's significant that God reassures Isaac, "I am with you." In that day and age, most deities were considered local deities. That is, they were tied to one particular location or one particular shrine. However, here with the promise that he will be with Isaac, Yahweh reaffirms for Isaac that that is not the case with him, that Yahweh is not a local deity, but that he will be with Isaac wherever he goes. The next part of the story, of course, is going to concern the conflict with Esau. And this conflict is actually divided up into two sections. As you can see, the first story of conflict between the brothers really happens before the story of Isaac and Abimelech, and then the second story of conflict happens here after chapter 26. So looking back briefly to chapter 25, beginning in verse 19, we're going to see that the conflict between these two brothers starts already while the two of them are in the womb. And Rebekah seeks out a prophecy and is told that there are two nations in her womb, but that the younger is going to end up serving the older. And so once the two boys are born, there apparently is more tension between them. The first story is that one day when when Esau is out hunting, he comes home famished. His brother Jacob is cooking some stew, and Esau willingly trades to Jacob his birthright for a bowl of the stew. The birthright was very valuable. As the oldest son, Esau would have been entitled to 2/3 of their father's estate, and he would have been the one that carried on the family name. And now he has given all of that up just to satisfy his hunger. Dr. Richter talks a little bit more about these family traditions and about what family life was like in ancient Israel, and so I would encourage you to take a look at some of what she says about that. Often when I have students describe the character of Jacob, they'll describe him as tricky and as conniving and things like that. And he may show some of those characteristics in this story. However, Dr. Arnold in his commentary suggests that Jacob also probably would have been more likely in this story to be perceived as cunning and wise, and he's able to get the better of his brother. The portrayal of Esau here is very unsympathetic. He is portrayed as somebody who doesn't have control of his own appetites and who is ruled by his hunger, which leads him to do something as stupid as giving up his birthright only for one meal. The conflict between the two brothers that really changes the entire course of the story, however, is going to be the one beginning in chapter 27 and going partway through chapter 28. This, of course, is the story where Jacob is going to trick their father Isaac into giving him the blessing that Isaac had intended to give to Esau. You're familiar with the story. One thing I like to note is how these biblical authors used some humor back in those days. For one thing, something that has always struck me has been the fact that Jacob tries to make himself feel like Esau by putting animal skins on his arms, so that when their old blind father Isaac touches him, he will think that he is touching Esau. The question has always occurred to me, how hairy were Esau's arms if Jacob covers himself with animal skins to make himself feel like Esau? In any case, Jacob, by trickery, by deception, gets the blessing from their old blind father, and just as that blessing is done, Esau comes walking in with the food that he has gone out to hunt, and he expects Isaac then to give him the blessing as they had planned. Isaac immediately realizes what he has done wrong, what he has been fooled into doing. However, Isaac also correctly states that there is nothing he can do. Once the promise is out of his mouth in that tradition, it is seen as having its own effectiveness, and there is no way that Isaac himself can reverse it or take it back. And so when Esau asks for a blessing also, the only thing that Isaac can say in verse 39 is, "See, away from the fatness of the earth your home shall be, away from the dew of heaven on high. By your sword you shall live, and you shall serve your brother. But when you break loose, you shall break his yoke from his neck." This story then is going to partly illustrate the tensive relationship between the Israelites and the Edomites, who are descended from Esau, and that is reflected already in this story about their origins. Jacob, of course, now is fearing for his life. Esau is so angry with his brother that he threatens to kill him. And so their mother, Rebekah, arranges, of course, for Jacob rather, to go back to a foreign land, to go back to the land around Haran, where the family had originally come from and where she had grown up. And so that's exactly what she does. She sends her son on his way. Now, once again, this raises a lot of suspense in the mind of a reader, because notice that Jacob now is the heir to that promise. That promise of land, descendants, and blessing, that covenant between God and the family, now rests with Jacob. Jacob is the one through whom that promise of land needs to be fulfilled, but yet what is happening to him? He is running away from that land to save his own life. And so, once again, the reader is wondering, wait a minute, how can this promise come to pass if the patriarch who now owns that promise is going away approximately 550 miles, as the picture suggests? And so once again, we're faced with the issue that we've been dealing with throughout the book, the question of how can the promise be fulfilled in spite of all the obstacles which arise. It is at that very moment as he is leaving and as he is right here in this location, that is Bethel, that he lies down that night as he is headed out of the promised land and he has his encounter with God. And part of what makes this story so significant is that in this encounter with God, in this dream of the angels ascending and descending, God appears to him and God essentially repeats to him the promise. In spite of the fact that he is going away from the land that God had promised to give him, God promises that the promises, lets him know, reassures him that the promise is still valid. He tells Jacob, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham, your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and to your offspring, and your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west, and to the east, and to the north, and to the south, and all the families of the earth shall be blessed in your offspring. Know that I am with you, and I will keep you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. So, God is going to give a promise to Jacob that the promise is still alive, that he will and his descendants will possess this land, and that God is going to bring him back. He also promises Jacob, I will be with you. Therefore, reassuring Jacob, just as he had reassured Isaac that he is not a local deity, but even as he goes off into a foreign country, God's presence is going to be with him. In terms of the ancient cultural background of this passage, many scholars have pointed out that this ladder that Jacob sees going up to heaven may be similar to what we call a ziggurat, which was a tall structure that stood next to ancient Near Eastern temples. And in ancient Near Eastern mythology, the deities would go up and down those ladders or those ziggurats. So the next day, Jacob gets up and he is going to continue his journey, and finally he is going to come to the house of his uncle Laban. And like the patriarchs seem to be doing so far, he is going to continue this pattern of wives being met at wells. As you can see from the outline, we're at section E now, which is Jacob with his uncle Laban and all the things that happen that he's there in chapters 29 through a good part of chapter 32. We see again that is at the central part of this concentric structure, and so it really is the heart of the story in the minds or in the eyes of the authors. What's interesting here is that even in section E, there is a further concentric structure, and so let's look briefly at that. So this is all of this is section E. That central part of your outline is now further broken down, and we see that Jacob will arrive at Paddan Aram. He will gain an advantage over Jacob. Then Jacob's children will be born. Then Jacob will gain an advantage over Laban, and then finally he will depart from Paddan Aram. So again, let's take a look at what happens here in some of these verses. Of course, the advantage that Laban gains over Jacob is that Jacob is tricked into marrying the wrong daughter. You'll remember that after fulfilling his obligation to work for Laban for 7 years, he comes and asks that now he be repaid by means of getting Rachel's hand in marriage. But the story tells us, beginning in verse 23, but in the evening of this wedding, he took his daughter Leah and brought her to Jacob, and he went into her. Laban gave his maid Zilpah to his daughter Leah to be her maid. When morning came, it was Leah. And Jacob said to Laban, "What is this you have done to me?" It's always struck me as, again, another source of humor here, that Jacob does not notice until the next morning that he has spent his wedding night with the wrong person. As I like to tell my undergrads, that reception must have been quite a wild affair that previous evening. We kind of get the idea or the understanding here that Jacob, who has kind of been the tricky and deceitful one, has now met his match. Jacob, the one who tricked Isaac into giving him the blessing that was meant for Esau, now himself is tricked into marrying the right woman. Of course, he is able to settle that with Laban and work another 7 years, and he is able to marry Rachel. And then we move to the central part here, which is the birth of Jacob's children. So we can say that if E, the story of Jacob and Laban, is the central part of the larger Jacob cycle, section 3 here is the central part of that central part, the birth of Jacob's children. So in fact, one could say this is kind of the heart of the entire Jacob cycle right here, is the birth of Jacob's children in chapter 29, verse 31 to chapter 30, verse 24. You see the birth now of all of these children after the characters have had so much trouble getting birth to children. Finally, the birth of all the children demonstrates God's fidelity and his bringing of life to his chosen people. It demonstrates God's fidelity and his giving of life to his people. So the blessing of life that God had promised is now well underway. That's kind of what this central section of the story is all about. From a historical perspective, some of the birth orders of these children and the mothers to which they are born also says a little bit about the history of these tribes as they were understood by the writers. For example, the Leah tribes, the tribes named after sons born to Leah, were probably originally one unit. You'll notice that some of the tribes are born not to Rachel and to Leah, but to the maidservants. And those maidservant tribes, the authors are probably trying to indicate, originally had a subservient status among the rest of the tribes in Israel. It's also interesting that Reuben and Simeon here are the oldest, but they are certainly not the most important tribes as the story continues throughout Genesis. And so this is probably an indication that these two oldest tribes, Reuben and Simeon, somehow had supremacy at one point, but that they had later lost that. We're going to see that next, after Laban had gained an advantage over Jacob here, that now Jacob is going to gain an advantage over Laban, and that's going to have to do with some kind of magical animal husbandry tricks that Jacob is able to pull off, so that all of the speckled and spotted sheep and goats are the ones that multiply, and those, of course, are the ones that belong to him, where the solid colored animals that Laban was counting on dwindle. Eventually, enough tension develops between Laban's sons and Jacob that Jacob feels the need once again to leave this area with his family. That tension is described in chapter 31, verse 1. And then in chapter 31, verse 2, Jacob is going to see what's going on. And in verse 3, the Lord will say to Jacob, "Return to the land of your ancestors and your kindred, and I will be with you." If you compare the Abraham and the Jacob cycles, you'll notice that God rather does not speak directly to Jacob as often as God speaks directly to Abraham. It seems almost that God is not as closely involved in the day-to-day details of their lives. But yet, that we're going to see that here, God is going to come back into the story. God is going to, again, speak directly to Jacob, and God is going to continue to repeat to him the promise. And so Jacob and his wives get up and they kind of sneak out under cover until Laban chases them down and asks them why they have left. They finally say their goodbyes. They set up a pillar in that spot where they have their final goodbye, kind of as a sign that God is supposed to watch over both Laban and Jacob to make sure that they don't again try to pull something on one another. He's supposed to keep them honest with one another. And then Jacob and the family begins moving back toward home. Of course, the suspense in the story is once again starting to rise because we remember that as Jacob is approaching home, Jacob is also approaching his brother Esau. And the last time these two had been together, remember that Esau had wanted Jacob dead. Esau had threatened his life. And so now Jacob is kind of like a man who may not be safe anywhere. He no longer felt safe with his relatives up in Haran, and so he left them. The only place he now has to go is back home to his family, but he doesn't feel safe there either, as we'll see, because he knows that Esau had wanted to kill him. Jacob sends some gifts ahead to try to appease his brother. And then we're going to see that Jacob will have another encounter with God in chapter 32, verses 22 to 32. So as he was on his way out of the land in a dangerous situation, Jacob has an encounter with God. And now as he is on his way back in the land, he is going to have another encounter with God as well. This encounter is going to result in Jacob's name being changed to Israel. And so this will give us the etiology for the origin of the people's name. Finally, in chapter 33, the two brothers are going to meet. Jacob will be scared to death when he sees Esau coming with 400 men. However, once they get together, Jacob sees that Esau is coming not with the intention of destruction, but rather for reconciliation. It is a moving scene as Jacob says to his brother, "No, please, if I find favor with you, then accept my present from my hand, for truly to see your face is like seeing the face of God." The word face here is used several times throughout these chapters significantly. First, Jacob saw God's face, and surprisingly, he had survived. In fact, face of God is the name given to the place where they had wrestled. And now he sees Esau's face, and he survives again. Dr. Arnold points out in his commentary that seeing a face indicates access to someone of higher status. And so Jacob does that, and he's able to survive. Finally, we're going to see that the second to last section will be the story of Jacob's sons and Dinah, and then finally the genealogy in chapter 36. So let me invite you to take just a few minutes to pause the video and jot down some of the main themes that seem to you to tie together the Jacob story. Okay, once again, with a lot of great detailed material, there are a good number of things you could have come up with. Arnold's commentary points out that the three themes he finds most significant are, first of all, blessing. And in this case, it's the matter of a blessing not only being given, but a blessing being stolen. Birth, especially the birth of the 12 children, which lies right at the heart of the story. And finally, land. Jacob and his family once again possess the land. These three themes correspond perfectly with the three promises that God had given Abraham back in chapter 12 of land, descendants, and blessing. Finally, I think it's significant to say something about the character of these people that we've been reading about. Once again, we see that Jacob, the great patriarch, the one who in his new name Israel would finally give his name to the entire nation, is not the perfect hero that believers through the centuries would want to emulate in every aspect of their lives. Rather, he was a person who could be tricky and conniving. He sometimes suffered the consequences for his action. But in spite of all this, God did not take the promise away from him, but continued to work in him and to use him as a patriarch. Finally, following the Jacob cycle, we're going to move to the Joseph story. I'm going to let you read that rather than saying a whole lot about it. The Joseph story We call it the Joseph story rather than the Joseph cycle because it is all one extended narrative. In the case of Abraham and Jacob, we have a series of independent stories which are kind of strung together. However, in the case of Joseph, we can see that the story is one long narrative designed as such from the beginning to the end. Probably one of the main themes of the Joseph story is going to be the theme of God's providence. And so the key verse from that story that I would point out for you would be chapter 45, beginning with verse 1 and going through verse 3. Joseph finally reveals his identity to the brothers who have treated him so badly. And Joseph said to his brothers when he does so, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" The brothers are caught in silence, and so they come forward, and Joseph once again repeats, "I am your brother Joseph." And then he says, "And now do not be distressed or angry because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life." Okay? In other words, Joseph forgives his brothers on the grounds that God is the one who had sent Joseph there. And the reason God had sent Joseph there through the actions of his brothers is because the famine was coming. The famine was coming to Canaan, and God, by having Joseph sold off to Egypt, made a way for the family to be provided for, had somebody in Egypt there that would be there to give them the food they needed when they came down to find help from the famine. And so, as you know, at the end of the story, the entire family moves down to Egypt once again, and they are reunited together. That will bring us to the end of the book of Genesis, and so we will pick up the story here at the beginning of Exodus in the next module.